So first things first, hopefully all of you know about the Huntington bursaries that are available on the Huntington website. A little financial boost is always helpful, especially if you're working hard through your courses. No harm in applying. The list of bursaries is out there. I don't know which ones each one of you will qualify for, but take a look at it. It's, if you know Huntington University's website, it's just www.huntingtonu.ca. And there's a link right on top saying student bursaries. So go ahead and click on that and see what you apply, what works for you. The other thing that I wanted to mention is this is a third year course. So some of you will be finishing up your third year and getting into your fourth year next year. Some students will be graduating using or will be doing a thesis, and some students will be graduating with course-based specialization if you're in the specialization. This doesn't apply to students who are doing a major and a minor. If you're specializing with a thesis, there is a qualification process, and there's a little bit of literature review and a write-up that you have to present to the department by the end of this March. So March 2021 is when you would finish the qualifier. I sent an email out earlier with an attachment. I'm not spamming you. I just want to let you know and keep you all in the loop that this is what's needed if you want to do the thesis. And also make it a habit to look at the top of your academic transcript when you go into self-serve on WebAdvisor. Make sure they say the right things, because sometimes I've had so many students in the past 6 months come up to me saying, well, that's not what I signed up for. I signed up for a major and a minor and it says specialization. Or a student comes to me and says, well, I'm doing a specialization. Why does it say 3-year concentration on my transcript? So we don't, and it's one of these odd things that when you start the program, you may not be entirely clear on what you signed up for. So you sign up for one thing and maybe your plans change or maybe there's a mistake. But yeah, definitely go check that. Misha, you have a question?
I was just going to say that I'm one of those students and it's really not fun trying to figure it out last minute. So yeah, definitely check the top of your transcript.
Yeah, just look. It'll take you 5 minutes of your life. And Anastasia said, okay, yeah, sorry, 1 second. There we go. All right. If any students want to talk to me specifically about anything specific, I know I have at least one student waiting after class to chat with me. I don't have too much time because I didn't plan, um, but yeah, we can definitely make more appointments to address each person's individual concerns regarding their own program. Yeah, just email registration. They will change things for you and they will switch you back to where you need to be. It's not a big deal. All right. Yeah, Cassidy is doing a double major and she was, oh, psych and religious studies. Yikes. Okay, Cassidy wouldn't have graduated with your double major then. That's scary when they put you in for a different major that you probably don't even have any courses in or few courses. Anyway, all right, not to go too much off topic now, I want to go ahead. This is chapter 3. We're talking about chapter 3 now. I'm going to turn my video off as well. I am still here, as you will hear my voice, but no video because, yeah, it's just I just want to make sure that the slides come through and you hear me clearly. Oh, I will turn on my video after when we're having discussions and stuff. Okay. Okay. So we are talking about how we select a problem that we want to answer using research. That's the focus of this lecture. And this is based on chapter 3 of your textbook. So there are the very first step in phase 1. We have 3 phases in the research process. Phase 1, the very first step is to select a problem. So when to select a problem, you have to make decisions. You have to sort out, you have to narrow, you have to clarify. You have to think very clearly. And oftentimes, one prerequisite of thinking clearly is you might have to throw away your favorite idea because that might not be researchable. It just might be something that you have already answers to, or it just might not, it might be too vague. It might be all encompassing. So most often, the beginning of any research process is simply curiosity. When we start to pursue answers to that curiosity, we are informally or sometimes formally, we are engaging in research. There are many starting points for research. There are some examples. There are many examples in your textbook as well. Make sure you read your chapters because it's great if you follow along in the lecture. That's very useful. But what it does, the combination of reading and then attending lecture, is it reinforces those ideas, makes you very comfortable with the content, and just keep up with the study tips. That is, once you've heard the lecture, made your notes or whatever it is, try to read the chapter around the same day or next day when these ideas are still fresh. So you get that layered learning effect. And what this does is come exam time, you're not stressing out because you already know. You don't have to actually prepare for the exam. You already know your stuff. Okay. Anyway, these are some examples for starting points. You can have an observation. You might notice, we all notice this, right? I for recreation, I play tennis. When I play tennis, I have a lot of people I play with who are in their early 70s, mid 70s, and a couple who are in their late 70s too. So clearly, these individuals are in very good physical health. They're also cheerful people and don't, very social, very amiable, and appear very, very content. So lots of positive things in the way their life is going for them. But at the same time, I have older adults in my family, and we also know that several older adults in different stages of life are not doing quite as well. So it might simply be an observation that some older adults seem to have better mental and physical health outcomes, or they age better than others. So that might be an observation, and then we start to ask why, what, who is it that um, is able to live out the full complexity of human life as they get older? Does it have something to do with physical activity? Does it have something to do with lifestyle? Now, you're all gerontology students. You might engage in asking deeper questions as to, oh, what were the social determinants of their life? How does the life course perspective come into play with these people? So, depending on what your background is, you will ask either very deep questions or very broad-based questions. Sometimes a research question or a research interest might be from a familial problem. So, we all are associated in some way or shape or form with older adults, and oftentimes families have to ask the question, well, we're helping grandma or grandpa or both at home, but is that a good decision? Are they able to perform their day-to-day activities or the activities of daily living? Is it better that they go to a more supportive environment, perhaps because either we or our parents who, for a lot of us, if your grandparents are in your 80s and 90s, your parents are probably their primary caregivers, if they're still living at home, or not necessarily caregivers, but support care is what they provide. So then the question is, well, as a family, since you have older adults in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, or older adults who simply have difficulty getting their day-to-day things done, is it a better idea to get them to a retirement home? So, then the family gets together and asks questions. What difference does it make? What kind of retirement home should it be? Would she be more alone there? Would she be more lonely? What happens to her mental health? What are the financials? Can grandpa or grandma afford the bed in the nursing home? And can we afford to support this situation? Because again, it's a question of, is there pension income to pay for these services? If you're low income, there is some kind of support, but then the kind of long-term care or nursing home you go to, or retirement home you go to, becomes quite different based on what you can afford. So an important family decision will always create questions that will lead to a research process. Now, families are typically not trained to do research, so it goes around in a very informal manner. But that is often a starting point for some form of research, not necessarily formalized research, but definitely some research. Often a news report becomes something that causes intrigue. So we often see this, and this is this on Sudbury.com, which is a local newspaper. I don't know if it's the same in other newspapers. There are often articles on how older adults are being scammed by, say, random emails or phone calls from the CRA saying they are in trouble, or door-to-door salesmen telling them, guaranteeing them a lower cost of electricity and having them sign contracts that they don't understand. Sometimes you get news reports about different things about older adults. 1 in 4 older adults need food banks. Hoarding is a major concern with older adults' mental health challenge. So these are all news reports, and questions might arise saying, wow, I didn't know this. This is very interesting. Has this always been the case? So for example, if you're thinking about the door-to-door salesman scamming older adults, has this been a common problem? Were older adults always scammed? Do younger people not get scammed? And so on. Or if you had the question about hoarding, is this something relatively new? Anyway, so these are all triggers or starting points for a research process. Sometimes it's a policy issue. So one of the policies that the previous Liberal government in Ontario enacted was the raising of minimum wage from, let's say, $10.75 to $14. It was a policy decision, and people speculated that it would make businesses go bankrupt. Other people speculated now that the quality of life for the people making minimum wage would be much better because they could afford more. Still other people speculated that, well, it's going to drive up inflation. These are all speculations, but it was the basis of all these speculations was a curiosity and concern about what might happen and the unpredictability of this change. So it was a policy. So oftentimes starting points are policies as well. The key thing to remember is no matter what the cause is for you to start your research, once you have the starting point, you have to go ahead and narrow down the question and clarify what it is that you're looking for. So one of the things that you have to do before you really get a firm handle on your question is to do what we call a literature review. The literature review is very important because it gives you a flavor for what's around. It allows you to think within the context of what's known and what's not known. And without having that information, it's really, really very hard to do very much. So one of the big things that a literature review allows you to do is to conceptualize. So conceptualize is to actually think about the problem in terms of concepts. We'll speak about concepts a little more. In principle, we all know what a concept is, but and perhaps because a lot of you have done the research literacy course, you could probably tell me what a concept is, and I'll ask you all in a minute. But basically, it assists us with identifying and preparing a good research question. Literature reviews also give us a very good idea about appropriate theory. What theory is applicable here? What research design? What are the variables that we are going to measure? When we don't have a clearly defined research question, which we often don't, when we start with an idea, a hunch, we don't necessarily have a very clearly defined question, and that's fine. But the moment you start to look at literature, we start to see what the big debates are in that field and who the big scholars are and what the challenges are. Once we know the big debates that are ongoing, then we can identify what's not known. So for example, if we are thinking about, let's say, older adults and their aging trajectories, there's a lot of research in that area. But what might not be known is, maybe an ethnocultural perspective does not exist. That might be missing. And that might be an area that you can explore. Maybe there are already a ton of papers showing the correlation of connectedness to good mental health, or the connectedness of daily physical activity with better physical health, and so on. Okay, so it's always a good idea to sort of read the literature to clarify to yourself. All major theoretical approaches in the social sciences have a good deal of research behind them. So it's a good idea to look at that for what are the theories around, so that you can choose your theoretical approach. Okay. Also, you get exposed to so many research designs. What research design are you going to use? What method will allow you to capture the most relevant data to answer your question? Okay, so formulation of a research question, it can take a while, and I'll give you an example. The students in my directed studies course and I and a couple of other researchers, we are doing a research project. We're doing what's called a systematic review on loneliness, social isolation, and the role of technology in mitigating these. And particularly, we're looking at it in the context of COVID. Now, as you can see, the way I've stated the question to you, it's not very clear. It's actually quite vague, and it's intentionally vague because we haven't yet sampled the literature that's out there. Once we have a good flavor, a good sense of what's out there, then the question can be refined to be very specific, and to actually do a specific search that goes and answers our research question. Now, other than literature review, which allows us to conceptualize is understanding concepts and their relationships to each other. That's what's conceptualization. Other than that, we are going to collect data in phase 2. At that point, we have data, we process the data, we have some findings from the data on a topic. But then data is kind of meaningless without context, right? So that's where the literature review comes in. So for example, if we're talking about, and we used this example, I think a couple of classes ago, we're comparing median income or income of the population in 3 different northern cities. That's great that you can compare them, but it becomes more significant if you're arguing in the context of greater economic growth of the province, saying, well, the cities in the north are not growing at the same rate as cities in the south, so more attention has to be paid to maybe infrastructure development in these cities. So it's basically placing what you're finding in a context. And that's why literature review becomes very important, even post data analysis. Before we go ahead, let's talk about what concepts are. Sometimes things move when they're not supposed to. Okay. Well, we'll go fastest finger. Whoever has their hand and whoever raises their hand can go. What's a concept? I think Arthika has her hand raised. Go ahead, Arthika.
So concept is an idea that stands for something or that represents a class of things or general categorization of an impression of something. This is directly out of the book.
That's fine. I have no problem with that. Part of learning is using the textbook, but would you like to give me an example so I know that you get it? Give me an example of a context. It doesn't have to be Arthika. Anybody else want to jump in? That's fine too.
Would social class be an example?
100%. Okay. So a concept is essentially a basket of ideas. There are many examples of concepts. It doesn't only have to be social class. Health is a concept. So for example, the challenge with the concept is we all kind of sort of have an idea of what a concept is. But two people, when you talk about, you could be talking about the same concept, but you could be talking about entirely different things. So for example, I could be speaking to Arthika and we are talking about health and we're saying how some people are more healthy than others. And then Arthika's thinking they're healthier because they are physically fitter, they're more active, they're doing A, B, and C. And I'm thinking healthier because they probably have fewer visits to the doctor. And they're completely different ideas, but they're still representative of the same concept. So the best way to think of a concept, like it's a basket of ideas. It's like saying groceries. Groceries don't mean, is not specific enough. It's you have a bag of groceries. Everybody understands what a bag of groceries means, but the contents of that bag could be quite different, and each of those contents could represent the term groceries. Okay, and that's the way to think about concepts. It's essentially a basket of ideas. A variable is a type of a concept. It's a concept that you can observe, that changes, and so on. And we will get to that in a little bit. But anyway, now going back to narrowing and clarifying the problem, the objective of the step is to produce a clear statement of the problem to be studied. You need a clear statement. Whatever you're trying to study, you need to be able to state what it is that you're trying to do. Step one is called unpacking a problem. Once we have a question in mind, we must break it down. This is called unpacking. So there are general questions that are helpful when we unpack any problem. So let's consider one of the problems. Does our favorite older adult have to move out of their residence and go to a supported facility? So what are the major concepts? So questions that are useful are to ask, what are the major concepts here? What is happening here? What are the issues? Is there a cause and effect? Or why is this so? So unpacking can help isolate issues much, much better. Unpacking starts at the level of identifying two concepts and goes on to then break things down even further. So for example, if you're thinking about grandma moving to a long-term care home, what do you think might be the main concepts? A couple of concepts here. It can be more, but we're just saying there are a couple of concepts. We're trying to make a decision that our favorite older adult, should they stay at home or should they go to long-term care home? What are the things we're going to consider? What are the concepts? Sorry, I don't have the right screen on, so I can't see people's hands. Steph, go ahead, please.
The first thing that sprang to mind is that maybe we should clarify what type of care we need, because there's a variety of different types of senior care available. There's assisted living, there's long-term care, there's retirement residences, for example.
Okay, so care, the type of care would be a concept. It's a broad basket of ideas. We'd have to define what types of care it is. So that would be one, yeah? And perhaps another concept in that situation would be connectedness. Perhaps that's very important. There can be many other concepts here. Affordability can be a concept and so on. So that's what unpacking is starting to unpack what the concepts are. We might pick concepts that are more important to us and not look at concepts that are of less importance. Perhaps your favorite older adult has significant financial resources, so the price might not. Yes, Cassidy, thank you. Cassidy says finances, 100%. So the finances would be an important concept if our favorite older adult was living on limited retirement income and didn't have lots of finances. If our favorite older adult had a ton of resources, that would not be an issue, right? So those are things to think about. And when we unpack and we start to break down all the concepts, when you have a problem in mind, we identify all of these different things. Anastasia says support. I know you've stated multiple times of types of support, but let's go mental, physical. And these are things to think about. Okay, accessibility, Anita, thank you. Okay. So let's try to unpack this notion, this sense that we have. Some older adults, some individuals age better than others. I just noticed that I'm missing an S. Okay, so if we were to unpack what are the concepts here, what might that look like? go, Suzanne. I don't know if you wanted to say something.
I was just thinking maybe diet or finances, physical attributes.
Okay, so some individuals ate better. So you want to look at, perhaps you want to look at the dietary patterns, diet, food, lifestyle. I'll just put that in one big basket because we're just looking at larger concepts. Yeah, Cassidy says lifestyle as well. That's one thing. That's let's say that's current. Then we also have to perhaps think of life course, which is different from lifestyle. Life course is their life journeys, their life trajectories, education levels. Education. I'm going to leave it education levels perhaps, but I'm going to leave it as a broad concept as education because that I want it to be mental framework or schema or mindset. Dana says culture. So it's quite obvious that there's a lot to it, right? So even when we start to unpack a concept like this, so even when we think about this, some individuals age better than others. It's so what are we saying by age better? Are we saying fewer diseases? Are we saying they're more active? And we have to choose. It's even when we say fewer diseases or more active, it's still relatively unpacked, and there are stages of unpacking that we typically have to go through to make things measurable and make sense. Quality of life scale scores. So it's very good. I mean, most of you have an idea of what the beginning of unpacking looks like. What unpacking does is it isolates multiple factors. So we're able to narrow things down. We'll have to pick a couple of factors to study because if we don't pick a couple of factors, can you imagine that we start off with a general idea that some older adults age better than others, and Dana has a comment, age better meaning their quality of life in terms of happiness and overall health, and it could, right? But the challenge is if you try to study everything, if we try to study the role, maybe the connection of diet, food, and lifestyle with their quality of life scores, that's a question all by itself. If you're trying to connect their life course and life trajectory with quality of life scores, different. If you're trying to connect their mental mindset and their approach to management of their chronic diseases, that's a different kind of question all by itself. So just with this one sentence, some individuals age better than others, you can end up with anywhere from 10 to 30 different researchable questions, okay? And that's not all that surprising when, as you get into doing research, you'll see that that's not particularly surprising because when you unpack, because aging better is a concept. Again, some individuals is a concept, right? And you're comparing individuals to individuals because when you say some individuals, what are their ages? What's their gender? Where do they live? Are they in the community? Are they in the long-term care? So again, very, very big baskets of ideas, of concepts. So it's not hard to imagine that you could potentially have 30 different researchable questions just from a simple sentence like that. We're probably not interested in researching 30 questions because nobody has that kind of time. We pick very defined questions that we try to answer. So unpacking isolates multiple factors, and you as a class have just demonstrated that. you can simplify it down. Are older adults in better physical shape due to higher levels of physical activity? Keep in mind, when I make that question, it is still not operationalized, which means you still can't measure anything. When I say, are older adults in better physical health due to higher levels of physical activity, even though it sounds very tempting that it's measurable, not yet. There are a few more steps, and we'll go through the process of operationalization probably later this lecture or next lecture. Um, or for example, if you want to ask, are older adults more satisfied due to the increased social connectivity that modern technology provides? Again, very, as simple as it is, it's actually a very complex question. So one of the ideas to narrow down our questions, because concepts tend to be complex, is to look at previous work. When we look at previous work and look as to how people have approached life satisfaction, you might find that people use quality of life scales or different scales that they might use. They might have several types of quality of life scales, and you might find that there's a strong argument for using one scale versus the other. Again, that's another place where your literature review becomes very important, because as you're reading literature, you get a very good idea as to what people use to measure these factors, and also how to make your question better. So there are several things that you may not have considered. Sometimes you may want to get the help of a librarian or a professor who's an expert at searching for literature to find the best keywords to help you with the search, so that you get the most relevant articles that are most sensitive and as well as very specific. So going back to the first question, should grandma be in a retirement home? And since our goal at this stage is to clarify the question, we have to unpack the starting point. We can start with something small. So in this case, to isolate this question for research, not necessarily for us to find a solution to the problem, that would be the eventual answer, and that would be the result of several smaller questions that we ask in the context of grandma being in a research home. So the questions why we might want to ask is, is grandma better supported? Probably the most important. From a caregiver's perspective, is the family stress level reduced, or is the family less stressed? And we're making very basic questions, because caregiving has a burden associated with it. It's an expensive time. It's more than anything, it's the time and it's the mental stress of having the responsibility of someone who is not completely independent, right? Is a particular location a better one? So there might be, again, are there any cultural factors associated with making this decision? So in some cultures, in Asian cultures, there's lots of filial piety, and as most of you know, or all of you know, it's an enormous amount of respect for the older adults, where they're almost deified. So it's almost not acceptable in several families to leave your older adult in a long-term care facility. It's definitely used to be unacceptable in East Indian families and Chinese families. It's gaining more acceptance now, because the reality is older adults are living longer, and often, sometimes in good health, sometimes not so much. And there's an extended level of dependency in some situations, especially if older adults are not completely independent in their, let's say, early 70s. And with life expectancy being in the mid 80s, that's a long time of stress and a lack of support that the family also experiences. So anyway, the point is these decisions are complex, but often when you try to answer these questions and you start to break it down, you start to ask smaller questions to answer the bigger question. So once we have narrowed down the problem, and we've limited ourselves to a few factors, we've decided that we can't explore everything. We have to restate the issue as a researchable question. This is a skill. It takes practice, and sometimes you have to go back and forth between your original question and the literature so that it's fine-tuned into something that you can answer. There are normally two ways that we state a research question. We can do it one of two ways. When we kind of sort of suspect an association or some sort of connection, what we use is known as a hypothesis. A hypothesis suggests a relationship, so it doesn't insist that there's one, it suggests there's one. Even an association is considered a relationship. So a hypothesis suggests a relationship between two concepts. Remember, a hypothesis is an assertion. Okay, it's different from a research question. A research question is not an assertion, and a research question is different in the sense that, for example, let's take the example of a hypothesis. I hypothesize that students that spend less than 3 hours a week preparing for a 3-credit course are likely to get below average marks in the class. Okay, this is a hypothesis. A research question is not a hypothesis. It's more or less when you don't have any basis. So a research question might say, this study hopes to look at the connection of the number of hours put in per course by the student and the marks that they obtain on a final exam, because there's probably no idea of whether there's a connectedness between hours studied and performance on an exam. So we've, the concepts is in bold. We already spoke about concepts, a broad basket of ideas, and that's the best way to remember it. They're categories, okay? A research objective always occurs when we don't know. So it explores the possibility. It doesn't even state that there's a relationship often. It's more looking at the possibility. And oftentimes a research objective may not even look at a relationship. It may just identify concepts. Particularly if it's qualitative research. Let me give you an example. Let's say you were to come up with an observation that lots of people from, let's say, Canada is a country with a revolving door immigrant policy. We've taken a lot of immigrants, they support our economy, and that's how it works. Let's say it's something we observe that the immigrants that come to Canada typically have good health, and we're not talking about refugee situations. We're talking about economic immigrants. They have good health and they earn good incomes and end up finding good jobs. Let's say this is an observation, okay? But you really don't know why. So your research question might be to inquire what factors cause newer immigrants, economic immigrants, to be financially and socially successful in Canada. And your proposal might involve interviewing a whole bunch of people from different countries in the world who have come in as an economic migrant, as someone who comes in through, they come in as a permanent resident because they have skills that Canada needs, and then they settle down, they get their citizenship and so on. So you go ahead and interview a whole bunch of these people, and you don't know what makes them more successful, and then you end up identifying that most of them have an advanced degree, most of them come from a background where education is emphasized, and probably most of them are in good health because the screening tool that they use for getting in economic immigrants ensures that you don't have people with chronic conditions coming into the country and being a burden on the healthcare system. Okay, so those might be the different concepts that you identify, and this is all made up. So this is I'm not telling you that this is what the answer is to this question. So typically, it's a good idea to diagram a hypothesis. Okay, so this is an example of a diagrammed hypothesis. So what we're saying is, the more social connections that an older adult has, they have better well-being. And if you're saying they are both connected in a positive way, so when this goes up too. So then what we do is we put a plus mark here. This is called diagramming a hypothesis between two concepts. As you can tell, this one is something that's measurable, number of social connections, but well-being is still quite undefined. And if you have to measure well-being, you'd have to have a variable for that concept. So let's try to diagram something different. At this time, I should probably introduce the idea of a nominal variable. Or categorical variable. And a continuous variable. However, before we speak about those things, it's a good idea to ask the question, what is a variable? We spoke about concepts being baskets of ideas. What is a variable? And if you feel like reading out of the textbook, that's fine as well. No problem. Anybody? All right, well, I'll go ahead because we need to get the show going. A variable is a type of concept. So for example, if you're looking at infants and we say growth, okay, it's a concept. Growth can mean height, can be weight, can be developmental milestones, and so on, okay? If we pick one measurable, if we say height of a child, okay, that would become a variable because that is representative of the concept, okay? It's a measurable form of the concept. That's what a variable is. It's a measurable form of the concept, okay? There are different kinds of variables. A continuous variable example would be height or weight. The reason it's called a continuous variable is you can actually be 34.5 inches. You can actually in weight be 5.5 kilos or 6 kilos. It's not impossible. It's variable, and it can have an infinite number of different options between point A and point B. Categorical variable is a little bit different. Categorical variable is the idea that you are one or the other. An example of a categorical variable is gender. If you have three categories, male, well, male and female are sexes, they're not genders, but say man, woman, and undefined. Let's keep it that way. If we can believe that there are three potential categories, then you have to pick one or the other. A more easier concept is pregnant, not pregnant, right? You can't be, well, I'm kind of pregnant. No, you're either pregnant or not pregnant, right? So it's a category. Partnered, non-partnered, dead, alive. Okay, so these are all very very categorical. So they're examples of categorical variables. So you can have many different types of variables, and that's the idea of the whole thing. Cassidy has a comment. She says independent and dependent variables, 100%, and that's a different idea altogether, and that relates to independent and dependent. Dependent and dependent. It's also types of variables, but the independent dependent is applicable in the context of a relationship. If you do not have a relationship, there is no independent and no dependent. So for example, if you're doing a qualitative study trying to look at what are the factors responsible for new economic immigrants being successful in Canada, there is no independent variable. There is no dependent variable because you're just trying to find the underlying context. Okay, so not every study will have an independent and a dependent variable. It completely depends on the study. Most qualitative studies, when you're trying to find out underlying factors, you are never going to have independent and dependent. So it's independent and dependent are in the context when you have two different variables, and what you're trying to do is trying to talk about a relationship between them. It's only in that context that independent and dependent becomes relevant. If you get a final exam question, the types of variables are 1, independent, 2, dependent, 3, categorical, 4, continuous, 5, all of the above. You must pick all of the above because that question isn't specific enough and it doesn't talk about a contextual relationship. However, if your exam question were to ask you, in a qualitative study attempting to explore the relationship of refugees coming to Canada and their adjustment to Canadian society, the types of variables that will be discovered are dependent, independent, not able to specify before the study is completed, D, none of the above. You'd have to pick C because you don't actually know what variables would come, and the independent and dependent wouldn't apply in that case. Does this concept make sense? Did I confuse everybody or is it crystal clear? Anita says yes, we have a thumbs up. Okay, I'm good to go. That's enough. Okay, wonderful. Good. Thank you. Okay, now so when we state the problem in the form of a hypothesis, okay, a hypothesis suggests a relationship, okay? The hypothesis must be very clear. When we make a hypothesis, if we choose to go that way, it must be very clear as to what the dependent variable is and what the independent variable is. So Cassidy had mentioned in the chat window that one affects the other. Okay, so typical rule of thumb is the independent variable is exactly what it is. It is independent, which means it does its own thing. And the dependent variable will depend on what happens as a consequence of the independent variable. So for example, let's pick something from Fit for Life course. So let's say age. Let's just say this is 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, okay? And here, let's say we'll call this lean body mass. Okay, I'm not getting too specific, male, female, nothing of that sort. We are just talking about two different concepts, okay? So in this case, it's very clear that age will occur no matter what. You're going to get older as long as you're alive, you will get older, okay? But it's lean body mass that changes as we get older. So your independent concept or independent variable is age, and the dependent variable is lean body mass. Okay. So for example, the number of social connections is positively correlated with well-being. Now this is a tricky one, but you could argue that the more socially connected you are, the better you feel. I had a student point out to me, well, the better you feel, the more likely it is that you will have more social connections. And that was an interesting, the researcher is able to use manipulation. So in the situation of an experiment, Cassidy, that would apply. There would be manipulation so that a certain outcome is being tested, right? So that's what would happen. So let's try to identify independent and dependent variables. We'll do a couple different examples. I think that might be fun. So we did the connectedness and well-being, physical fitness and activity. So let's say you have two concepts, physical fitness and activity. Okay, so which one do you think should be independent and which one should be dependent? What do you think? So are you physical? Okay, independent is activity, Arthika says. So the individual is able to perform more activity. They will have more physical fitness. Dependent physical fitness. Yes, I agree. That's yeah, independent is activity, so that's your independent variable. That's your dependent variable. If you have more activity in your life, you're likely to have more physical fitness. So that wasn't particularly challenging. In a very twisted way, it is possible to argue that if you engage in, if you maintain physical fitness, you can do more activity. So it's the most logical line of thought is if you have more activity, you would have more physical fitness. But again, when you determine what is independent and what's dependent, it's contextually driven. So it is possible to argue the other way as well. Anastasia says, I believe by engaging in more physical activity over time, it'll help slowly increase an individual's ability to do things and become somewhat fit. So this is a classic example of what I'm saying. So what happens is when we talk about independent and dependent variables, there are some situations where it's crystal clear as to what's independent and what's dependent. So age versus lean body mass. There is no question that with age, if you are not intervening using exercise and diet, your lean body mass goes down. Nobody is going to question that age is independent and lean body mass is dependent. Okay, you can't argue, like nobody in their right minds can argue that if you increase your lean body mass, you'll decrease in age. Can't argue that. Impossible. You can say your body aging can be slowed down or things like that if you increase your physical fitness, right? So, but there are other concepts where it's often hard to, you have to think carefully. And that's why I brought this example up, because sometimes it becomes challenging to clearly determine what's, what is independent and what's dependent. Anastasia also says, I noticed that even with older adults mentally with dementia, with daily engagement in small activities, even in small amounts during their placement, that's 100% too true. There are a lot of studies showing that engaging in some amount of cardiovascular activity, some amount of strength training, even for older adults with dementia, or engaging in activities such as music, which are more holistic, even more because there is a physical thing to it, but there's also sensory attachment to that activity. There are improvements in cognitive function, there are improvements in physical functionality, and so on. Okay, but more importantly, what I wanted to emphasize is that the independent and dependent variable, often you'll see in textbooks, it's, it comes off as like, oh my God, it's this crystal clear thing as to what's independent and what's dependent. Sometimes it isn't. Okay, sometimes there might be no connection. So let's take an example of something that I don't want to say no connection, but questionable connection. Okay. Two separate concepts. Are more religious people more spiritual? Are more spiritual people more religious? What do we think? Anastasia says, disagree. So is there a relationship between the two? If you were to think, is it even possible to say plus, positively related, negatively related? Go ahead.
I believe that with this question, it can be a yes or a no in whether a person can be religious and spiritual or not. I've learned somewhat from personal experience working with people who are religious and not who said, I am a religious person, but I don't see myself as spiritual. As well as there's other people who say, I'm very spiritual, but I'm not. Say society looks at it as a religious person that say follows a certain religion and takes part in daily rituals and other stuff that's say written within that religion itself. There's things that even people can do for themselves that is very spiritual, but doesn't follow specific guidelines.
Thanks, Anastasia. It's very complicated. I mean, I find it easier to think about religion and spirituality like this. I think of them as two circles. I wish I had a different color on my iPad for my pen, but I don't. But if we call this religiosity and we call this spirituality, there is an overlap. There are some people who are both religious and spiritual. Okay, and I might be getting the areas wrong. And that speaks to Artika's comment that they're interconnected. They can be. There's a population that is both religious and spiritual, but a lot of people who are religious are not spiritual, and a lot of people who are spiritual are not religious. Okay, so religiosity and spirituality, it's hard to argue that there's a very strong connection. My father-in-law, he isn't alive anymore, but extremely spiritual person, barely religious. Yeah, and my dad's the opposite. My dad's very religious and borderline spiritual. Okay, so they go different ways. I'm neither religious nor spiritual, unfortunately, so it doesn't apply to me at all. But it's a complex. They're complex concepts, and sometimes concepts may not be related. So the idea is that we have to understand that two concepts can be related in a positive way, which means when one goes up, when the independent increases, the dependent increases. In the case of age versus lean body mass, when the independent increases, as age increases, lean body mass decreases. So if we were to diagram that, we would have to put a negative sign here, okay? And the reason we'd put a negative sign is because when one goes up, the other goes down. Now remember, whenever you diagram a hypothesis for yourself, for your own understanding, you keep the independent on the left side. This is always independent. You keep the dependent variable on the right side, okay? And you also further indicate the relationship by drawing a line and making an arrow indicating the influence of the independent over the dependent variable. And then you typically put a plus sign or a minus sign stating or showing that they're positively related or negatively related. If you can't put a plus or a minus, like say with religiosity and spirituality, you don't put a sign, and you may not even be able to put an arrow because you can't identify which one's independent and which one's dependent. My grandmother is strongly both. Thank you, Cassidy. Yeah, it's possible to be both. Okay, now sometimes it is not possible to make an assertion. Okay, so it's then you have something called a research objective. A research objective is when you don't necessarily have a notion that things work a certain way. A research objective does not suggest or does not assert a relationship. You can't box out a research objective. So for example, if you're trying to find out why, well, let's pick a reason. Why a lot of people from certain parts of the world end up opening restaurants in Canada when they come. You have no idea as to what, the only thing you know is preferred profession is opening of restaurants. Okay, but you have no idea as to any number of dependent concepts that might, or even related concepts. We don't know which one's going to be dependent and which one's independent. We have no idea as to what that relationship could be between two factors. So it's particularly useful when the goal of your research is descriptive. So research objective is one way to state a research question without suggesting a relationship, particularly useful when you go into qualitative research. What are the different factors that make students choose gerontology? Or what are the different factors that are important for students choosing to do a thesis if they're in the specialization program in gerontology? These are research objective type questions. So, and the objective is to describe and then ultimately identify concepts from what comes out of the interviews or from detailed questionnaires. Research objectives are also important when you're studying phenomenology. What does it feel like? So for example, studying the phenomenon, what is the experience of having to do all your lectures and all your education using Zoom? What's going on here? How are students feeling? How do they perceive their quality of education? So that would be a study of phenomenology. I can't state a hypothesis because I have no clue as to what those different concepts are, how you're experiencing your learning, and so on. Okay, so it's very different. Now, the research objective is if we're trying to identify or describe, then research question is the way to go. Okay, fun time. You have 3 different research questions, okay? Now, what I want you to do, and how do we do this? Should we split you up into teams? If I split you up into teams, then this screen magically disappears. So I don't want to do that. Well, you know what we'll do is, let's look at the full class list. I'm just going to see side by side. Okay, each one of you pick one question to work on. I'll randomly ask for volunteers to suggest. Don't work on all 3. Just pick one and work on it. So try to write down a research hypothesis where you identify an independent and a dependent variable. All of them are hypotheses, okay? But there's a general research question that's being provided. What's the relationship between gender and income levels? The second question is, how does race and racism impact positive health outcomes? And I know there's one student in the class who's an absolute expert on that topic. So I'm going to invite that student, if she's volunteering, to not write that particular hypothesis because they know it very, very well. What is the relationship between volunteerism and education level? So go ahead and create a hypothesis and identify the independent and dependent variable. Pick one. Don't each person just pick one. And I can't guarantee that everyone will be asked to respond, but you may be called upon to do so. So go ahead and do it. We'll give everybody, it's 12:36. We'll give everybody until, well, 12:37. We'll give everybody until 12:41, 5 minutes. All right, time's up. So what we'll do is I will request volunteers for research question 1. Ireland.
So I was I chose question 1,
Okay.
and then for my research hypothesis, I said that males are more likely to have higher income levels than women.
Excellent. Okay. Given the sentence, have you identified what the independent variable is, Ireland?
Yeah, so I put the independent variable as the gender, and then the dependent variable as the income, since the income depends on the person's gender.
Excellent. Well done. Good.
Thank you.
Perfect. Good example. Okay, so next question. How does race and racism impact positive health outcomes? Anybody? Any volunteers? Cassidy.
Hi. So for my research hypothesis, I decided to go with, do Indigenous students attending Canadian universities have higher mental illnesses due to racism? And that's because of a previous course that I have took.
Indigenous students have greater mental health challenges. Independent variable, Cassidy?
I would say that racism would be the independent variable because that would affect their mental health.
Who do you have to be to have this mental health challenge? Who do you have to specifically be?
The Indigenous individual. So that would be the independent?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. So it is a categorical variable, much like gender, much like Ireland's example. But your 2 boxes here would be Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Those would be your independent variable. So you're either Indigenous or not, and if you're 1, then you have mental health challenges, fewer, greater mental health challenges. And this is a complex one, right? So you have to be one of 2 things, and then due to the exposure, due to the assumption that there is racism prevalent, we say there are mental health challenges, and so your dependent variable will be mental health challenges. And again, keep in mind, we don't have any measurables here. All I'm trying to do is get you people to think in terms of conceptualizing, okay? So we're not going for operationalization here. Catherine says she has similar answers, very similar to Ireland's. Thank you, Catherine. Okay, question number 3. The relationship between volunteerism and education level. Steph, go for it.
Okay, I put the higher the level of post-secondary education one has obtained, the less likely one is to volunteer.
Okay, so greater levels of education is correlated. I'm just simplifying it a bit with lower volunteerism. Okay, Steph, what's the independent variable?
Level of post-secondary education.
Level of post-secondary ed. Okay, and your dependent variable is?
Hours spent volunteering.
Yeah, that's sad, if that were actually true. I don't know if it's true, but it's an exercise, so that's fine. But if that were actually true, that would be sad. You'd think that the more educated you are, you'd understand the value that volunteers bring to our economy, eh? But yeah, no, thank you. That's perfect. That's a great example. Okay, good. We have one more exercise, and this is called a 1-minute paper. A 1 minute paper means literally 60 seconds. You have 60 seconds to write a paper, and all it means is you write everything you know, shorthand, freehand, doesn't matter, in a very free flow manner. And your topic, okay, let's identify your topic, because as much as this is fun, let's talk about immigrants in Canada. Okay, write everything you can. You have 60 seconds. Do we have 60 seconds? Yeah, we have 60 seconds. You have 60 seconds to write everything you can about immigrants in Canada. Okay, in 1 minute, we'll break this exercise down a little bit more.
Can it be point form?
It can be any way you like.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, time's up. Can't write anymore. Okay, identify. Again, you have not done any literature research, okay? So on your own topic, what you're expected to do is identify the gaps of understanding for future research. So let's have a volunteer based on what they wrote. What do you think? What is the stuff that you don't know? What's the gap in your understanding? Anybody? Okay, we have Cassidy and then Carly, and then we'll move on to the next question. So Cassidy, go first. Why they wish to immigrate? Anastasia says why, but we'll have Cassidy go next. Cassidy?
So what I thought of right away was how welcoming Canada really is to the immigrants coming here, because I find we might be a little bit more naive than we know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, how welcoming is Canada? Thanks, Cassidy. Carly?
I was just like, I don't fully understand like immigration rates, so that might contribute to my greater understanding if I did.
Rates of immigration. So each one of us has some understanding about the concepts, right? Dana says if the immigrants are refugees or not. And I'll tell you, this is not a nowhere exercise. There's a goal. Struggles to get to Canada. Anita says purpose. Cassidy says the immigration process. Okay, we'll stop here because I want to get to the next point. But these are all great ideas. And I'll tell you what the objective of having this 1 minute write down is. Okay, now from what you wrote, what do you think might be related concepts to each other? We'll just have 2 shout outs. We won't go more than that because we don't have that much time left. What might be related? I'm just going to say safety and financial security. It's 2 concepts that I think about when I think of immigration. Anybody else? Opportunities, yes, employment opportunity. 100%. That's opportunity related to what? So you have opportunity. Cassidy says racism. You have to tell me more than one concept, and because we're talking about what concepts are related. Systemic racism and, let's say, systemic racism and housing. Okay, let's say racism and housing. Goals, personal goals, and better future. There we go. So these are concepts you think about, right? When you think of why people leave their homes and families and come to a different country. Okay, good. The reason this is important, that's the point of this, is when we do this 1 minute thing, you can do it without doing any reading like we did just now. But often when you do this, it doesn't have to be 1 minute, it can be a 5 minute thing. When you start to write on the basis of everything you've read, you all of a sudden start to understand that there are so many factors, so many concepts, so many ideas out there that are that can be used to refine your search and look for more relevant literature out there. So for example, if right now I'm studying social isolation and the use of technology in mitigating social isolation, as I read through literature, I might find that people who don't speak English or French are more socially isolated. I might find that people who are more disconnected from, say, the touch tablet kind of technology, the kind of technology that's available and easily accessible to all of us right now, they feel more isolated. Or the people who are in long-term care facilities where their language and their culture isn't necessarily supported, feel more isolated. So there are so many concepts. What it does is it gives us keywords to do a better literature search, and that's the basis of writing this little thesis. And I often, when students are doing a thesis project with me or a research project with me, I'll get them to sit down and take 2 or 3 minutes. Usually I tell them 5 minutes so they can actually sit and write. And it's very free form. You're not really trying to look at papers and write a lot of stuff. So it's stuff. It's just like you've read a bunch of stuff. Now just start to write things that are in your mind, and it can be point form, it can be complete mishmash, it can be little balloons, little pop-up, it doesn't matter. And the idea is you start to get these terms. So an important step in a successful literature review is to identify. So some of the things you'll find is when you write stuff out, there's lots of synonyms. A good literature search, you will cover all synonyms or keywords so that you can broaden your search efforts. And as students, you can create a chart for a visual representation. And that's why I was talking about bubble diagrams and stuff like that. It's, those of you who see our themes, as Cassidy says. So those of you who have seen CSI, or I don't know which is the other program, they often have these big charts depicting, the criminal association with different activities, and they have arrows pointing one thing to another. Those visualizations are actually very, very helpful when you conduct research. We are at 12:54, 4 minutes over. So we won't go through the next exercise, but this lecture is not yet done. So I will wait to post the lecture slides because I don't want to give away the next part. It's quite interesting. And there's a little 5-minute video that I want everyone to see as well. Okay, so just hang on. You can still capture most of the lecture from the video itself, which will get posted today. And there's absolutely nothing that I'm not using a textbook as a source for. So if you read the textbook chapter, you should be fine as well. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to stop lecture now. We are beyond time. I apologize. I know there are a couple of students waiting to chat with me, not regarding the course, but regarding other things. Please stay online. And thank you very much for.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, I suppose Misha, oh, no, Misha and Anastasia want to talk to me. Is that who we have separately?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put you both in breakout rooms. So I'll come and talk to you first. Who has to be someplace right away? So I'll attend to them first.
I'm okay to wait.
Okay, all right, give me 1 second. I'll put you both in breakout rooms. Let's create 2 breakout rooms. Well, we just need the one because no, let's close this. Hold on, breakout
You're also
rooms.
still recording, just so you know.
Stop the recording.